Hercule Poirot and the page Nobody. Wrote Chapter 1, The Last Blank Page. A spring breeze fluttered through the ancient trees of the Montreuil-sur-Loire estate, rustling the branches as if whispering a long-kept secret. It was a quiet afternoon, but inside the Arnaud mansion, the silence held an oppressive weight. In the office of the renowned novelist Etienne Arnaud, sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds, tracing golden lines on the Persian rug, and on the desk, next to an uncapped fountain pen, lay an unfinished manuscript, The Midnight Confession. Arnaud's body was found shortly after tea-time, slumped in his leather chair, his head tilted and a frozen expression of shock on his face. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a half-empty coffee cup and the final page of the manuscript. Blank. "My God!" exclaimed Veronique, his wife, 30 years his junior, upon discovering the scene. "I was just writing. I was the one who brought him the coffee." Dr. Lacroix, hastily summoned from the village, pronounced sudden death from a heart attack. But there was something unsettling. Arnaud was only 59 years old, in good health, and the cup didn't smell of the usual robust aroma of black coffee. In fact, it gave off a sweet, almost imperceptible scent, like soft almonds. The local police took note, but soon filed the case as a natural death. Too convenient for some, especially Miss Elise Fournier, the deceased's personal secretary. "Monsieur, Arnaud never left a manuscript unfinished," he told Inspector Bertrand firmly. "And that last page, he didn't write it. At least he didn't leave it blank of his own volition." The story could have ended there, like one of those unresolved novels that Arnaud himself detested, but fate, or perhaps an obsessive devotion to the truth, intervened in the form of a perfectly trimmed moustache and a meticulously organized grey suitcase. Hercule Poirot arrived at the estate 3 days after the burial, invited by a hurried letter sent by Elise. He had met her years earlier, when a literary blackmail affair had crossed their paths in Brussels. She knew well that the Belgian detective didn't believe in coincidences, and that for Poirot, even a blank page could scream guilt. He was greeted by Veronique in the main hall, which smelled of lilies too fresh for a house of mourning. "Monsieur Poirot, I regret that we met under these circumstances. My husband greatly admired your mind." Poirot bowed slightly, his eyes scanning the young widow's every gesture, as if they were paragraphs to be interpreted. "Madam, even in the most tragic theatre, the curtain doesn't fall until the final scene is understood, and in this case, the act isn't even over yet." Upon entering the deceased's study, Poirot examined the desk, the neatly lined shelves of books, the unfinished manuscript, and, of course, the cup. He sniffed it briefly, frowned, and then looked at Elise, who was watching him anxiously from the doorway. Did Mr. Arnaud usually drink coffee before writing? Never. Just jasmine tea at night. Coffee made him nervous. She replied without hesitation. Poirot nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the manuscript. Who else had access to the office? Elise listed the names. His wife, of course. His son from his first marriage, Lucien Arnaud, who had just arrived from Paris to discuss a possible film adaptation. The author's personal editor, Gérard Morel, was staying at the house to supervise the final manuscript. And the housekeeper, Madame Colette, who had been present at the estate for 20 years. 5 people, 5 possible perpetrators of a non-violent death, and one of them, according to Poirot, had written the most perfect crime of all, the one hidden behind a page no one wrote. Poirot smoothed his fists and a look of satisfaction appeared on his face. "Very good. Let's start with the reasons, because where there's heritage, there's suspicion, and where there's unfinished art, there's lies." Chapter 2. Echoes Among the Books. Hercule Poirot examined the office with an almost stage-like calm, as if he were performing a play whose actors didn't know they were being watched. His footsteps made no sound on the carpet, but his gaze spoke volumes. Every object, every shadow, every small irregularity played a role in the story behind Etienne Arnaud's death. Élise Fournier, her hands clasped tightly, watched him from the doorway. She was a discreet woman, with brown hair tied back in a simple bun, and an expression of restrained intelligence. Poirot turned to her with a sharp look. "Mademoiselle Fournier, can you tell me who was the last person to see Monsieur Arnaud? Alive? He hesitated for a second, but quickly recovered. Madame Veronique brought him coffee shortly after lunch. Then I went up to leave some editing notes on his desk, but I didn't want to disturb him. The door was ajar, and he seemed deep in thought. And what time was that exactly? 3:10, according to the clock in the hall. I always check it before I go up." Poirot nodded slowly. "And when was the body found?" Almost an hour later, Madame Veronique went back upstairs to get the cup, and each screamed. Poirot turned his attention to the desk. He walked over to the inkstand and carefully lifted the fountain pen that still lay next to the manuscript. "Funny, isn't it?" Mr. Arnaud stopped writing in the middle of his most anticipated work, without even a final line. Was that typical of him? Never, monsieur. He had an almost superstitious obsession with closing each chapter before leaving his desk. He said that leaving a page unfinished was like leaving your soul open to crime. Poirot raised an eyebrow. What a prophetic phrase. At that moment, the door behind Elise opened, revealing a thin man, dressed in a dark suit and with a weary, ironic expression. He had the eyes of someone who had already lost several battles with the world. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said in a deep voice. "Lucien Arnaud, I take it you're the Belgian detective." Poirot bowed politely. "Hercule Poirot, at your service." Lucien entered uninvited, his gaze resting on the incomplete manuscript. So Dad died writing. Quite ironic, isn't it? The man who made his fortune unravelling other people's secrets leaves his own unresolved. Poirot watched him closely. Lucien showed no sorrow, not even bewilderment, only a measured indifference, as if he had rehearsed the role many times. "Did you have a good relationship with your father, Monsieur Arnaud?" "Good. That would be too strong a word. Cordial, when it suited us. I distanced myself from the last name years ago, although he, of course, never stopped using it to manipulate." Poirot narrowed his eyes. Manipulate? He always wanted control. Over the narrative, over the people, over his legacy. He even offered me a share in his will if I agreed to adapt his next novel for film. I declined, of course. Poirot nodded slowly. This wasn't just an anecdote, it was motivation. And do you know if anyone else had anything to lose or gain with his death? Lucien smiled with a mixture of mockery and resignation. Monsieur Poirot, everyone in this house has something to hide. Veronique, who feigned a devotion she never had. Élise, who lived in the shadow of her genius. Morel, who feared that Etienne would break his publishing contract for a more lucrative one. And Madame Colette? Well, she knows more about this family than any of us. Poirot studied him for a moment longer, then looked towards the study library. Do you know the contents of these books? Lucien shrugged. Novels, ancient manuscripts, a collection of rare books he never let anyone touch, just like himself. Poirot approached the shelves, slowly running his fingers over the precisely aligned spines, and then he stopped. One volume, identical in shape and colour to the others, had a slight dent in the bottom corner, an almost imperceptible indentation, as if it had been recently knocked. He gently removed it. What is this? The book was hollow. Inside, carefully wrapped in wax paper, was a letter without an envelope. It was handwritten, in a handwriting different from Arnaud's. Poirot didn't open it yet. He turned to Élise and Lucien with a flashing gaze. Messieurs, it seems that our author, even in death, has left us hidden chapters. Chapter 3. The Letter Without an Addressee. Poirot held the letter with the same delicacy with which a surgeon holds a scalpel before the final incision. His eyes scanned the paper without yet reading it, as if he wanted to absorb the weight of his existence before absorbing its contents. Then, slowly, he unfolded the sheet. Élise and Lucien watched in silence. The former with contained tension, the latter with an chiaothed air of bored disbelief. The handwriting was angular, cramped and written in somewhat faded black ink. Poirot read in a low voice, barely moving his lips. He finished in less than a minute, but he didn't say anything immediately. He carefully folded the letter and placed it inside his linen handkerchief. Only then did he look up. An unsigned letter, undated, but written with great intention. "And what does it say?" Lucien asked. "That, monsieur, is not yet the time to share. Knowledge, like the ingredients of a precise recipe, must be added at the exact moment," Poirot replied with a slight smile. Lucien snorted and left the office without another word. Élise remained. "Do you think that letter has anything to do with his death? I'd say it's not the cause, but perhaps it's the key to everything else. Tell me, mademoiselle, do you know if Monsieur Arnaud was in the habit of hiding things? He said that every good writer is also a good magician, and like every magician, he had secret compartments." Poirot tilted his head with interest. "And could any of those compartments hold something more important than a letter?" Élise nodded. "Behind the central panel of the library. There's a hidden cavity, but only Madame Colette and I knew how to open it. At least I thought so." Poirot turned his attention to the bookshelf again. He moved some books very carefully until he found the spring, a small fleur-de-lis carved into the wood that, when pressed, released a sharp click. The panel opened slowly, revealing a recessed compartment. Inside were three things: an antique pocket pistol, a small silver box engraved with a family seal, and a brown envelope sealed with wax. Poirot took the pistol and inspected it. Unused, clean, just an intimidating device, or a memento. She set it aside and opened the small silver box. Inside, a broken locket. The photograph inside showed a young woman, very different from Veronique or Elise. "Do you recognize her?" "No," Elise whispered. "I've never seen her." Poirot nodded silently and turned his attention to the envelope. The wax seal bore no coat of arms, but it did bear an irregular mark, as if it had been torn and remade. He opened it. The contents were several typewritten pages signed by Etienne Arnaud. They were titled "Literary Will, only open in case of betrayal." "Ah," murmured Poirot, "the novel of real life." The pages told, in confessional style, a disturbing story. Etienne had discovered that someone close to him was planning to betray him, possibly even murder him, to steal his work and his name. He didn't name names, but spoke of a new serpent with the face of an angel and an editor with the smile of an executioner. "So he suspected?" Elise asked, horrified. "More than suspicions, he was afraid. A fear that, like a good playwright, he managed to conceal until the very end. But now we have a shadow, a faceless figure approaching him under the mask of affection." Poirot sealed the envelope and put everything back in the compartment. Then he turned to Elise. "Don't say anything to the others yet. The truth, mademoiselle, grows like tea. It must be infused in due time." At that moment, a knock on the study door announced Madame Colette, a woman in her 60s with an upright posture and a stony face, dressed in a mourning that seemed more uniform than emotional. "Monsieur Poirot, would you like some tea on the terrace?" Madame Veronique had it prepared. "With pleasure. But first, madame, tell me something. Did you know about this hidden compartment?" Colette was unfazed. "There's not a corner in this house I haven't cleaned at some point. Yes, sir, I knew it was there, but it wasn't my place to open it." Poirot looked at her for a few more seconds, then nodded. "I appreciate your honesty. And now, let's have that tea. I think it'll soon be time to start asking formal questions. The scene is set, the characters are in place. All that's left is for the second act to begin." And as he walked out, the unfinished manuscript was still there, its blank page like a muffled scream in the silence. Chapter 4. Shadows under the tea light. The terrace of the Arnaud estate offered a charming view of the Loire River, its golden reflections dancing in the afternoon sun. A small wrought-iron table, adorned with wild flowers, was set with porcelain cups, slices of lavender sponge cake, and a steaming teapot. But neither the sweet aroma nor the warm breeze could erase the invisible tension between those present. Veronique, Arnaud, dressed in mourning with studied grace, sat with perfect posture. Opposite her, Poirot, in his impeccable grey suit and gleaming moustache, poured the tea with almost ritualistic meticulousness. "Madame," he began in his gentle but firm tone, "your husband left more than one secret unresolved, even before his death. Would it seem too direct if I asked you what you knew about the fears he'd been harbouring lately?" Veronique started, barely perceptibly. "Fears? Do you mean concerns about your health?" Poirot shook his head with a slight gesture of his hand. "No, madam. More personal fears. Of betrayal, perhaps." The young widow put the cup back on the saucer without taking a bite. Etienne was always reserved, sometimes paranoid. He thought everyone was trying to take advantage of his fame. That even included his son, his publisher, but he never mentioned any real danger to me. Poirot studied her carefully. And yet, you were the one who brought the coffee the afternoon he died. Did you notice anything unusual? Nothing. He barely looked up. I handed him the cup and went downstairs immediately. I thought he was writing as usual. Did you make the coffee? Yes, although I didn't usually do that. The cook was away, and I didn't want to bother him with delays. Was it normal coffee? I used the bottle Elise always used for him. I didn't even open it. I just mixed it with hot water and brought it up to the top. Poirot nodded, still watching. Her face. Funny. Elise told me that Monsieur Arnaud didn't drink coffee in the afternoon. No? Veronique blinked. Well, he asked me for coffee that morning. He even joked about needing a dose of bitter reality before writing the final scene. And that scene? Did it exist? Excuse me? The final scene in the manuscript. He mentioned it as if it were planned. Veronique swallowed. I couldn't say. I didn't read his drafts. Poirot was silent for a few seconds, as if weighing the truth of that statement. Then he leaned forward slightly. Did you know the woman with the medallion? The question fell like a dagger. What woman? The photograph that Monsieur Arnaud kept in a silver box hidden in his study. Veronique slowly shook her head, but she couldn't help a slight tension in her lower lip. No, I don't recognize her. It could be someone from his past. Etienne was a very private man about his youth. More reserved than his relationship with you. She didn't respond. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it charged the air with suspicion. Madame Arnaud, Poirot said finally, would you mind if I spoke to the cook and the housekeeper? I'm particularly interested in the moment when you decided to bring the coffee yourself. Of course not. You can talk to whoever you like. I have nothing to hide. And without adding anything else, he stood up and left with the studied elegance of someone who carries a duel more as an act than as a wound. Poirot followed her with. His eyes then turned to Elise, who was approaching from the garden path. Are you done with her? He asked quietly. We've barely begun. Tell me, mademoiselle, who knew about the silver box? Just me, and maybe Madame Colette. But I'm sure Veronique never set foot in that compartment. She hated it when Etienne kept secrets. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And what about Lucien? Was he close to your father professionally? I admired him, but I couldn't stand him. Etienne never approved of his career as a filmmaker. He said celluloid was vulgar, that words should live on paper, not on screens. And yet he offered him the manuscript for adaptation. He threatened to remove him from the will if he didn't agree. Poirot slowly rubbed his moustache. So we have an unfinished manuscript, a hidden will, and a cup of coffee laced with almonds, he murmured. It's all very literary, don't you think? What do you suggest, Monsieur Poirot? I suggest that the culprit didn't simply want to murder the man, but to rewrite his final chapter. Elise shuddered. And what will be the next step? Poirot stood up, smoothing his jacket. I'll interview Gérard Morel, the editor. I want to know what kind of story he was actually financing, and if any other readers had access to the ending that Monsieur Arnaud never wrote. Chapter 5. The Editor and the Latest Version. Gérard Morel was waiting for Poirot in the secondary library, a more modest room than the deceased's study, but with the same air of solemnity. He was a middle-aged man, with round glasses and an unkempt moustache, with the pallor of someone who spends more time under a desk lamp than in the sun. Beside him lay a pile of documents tied with a silk bow, and a barely touched glass of cognac. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, still in a subdued voice, "I was wondering when you'd come to see me. I suppose you also want to know if it was me who put poison in the cup." Poirot smiled gently. "No, Mr. Morel, I'm not looking for culprits yet, just pieces. And you, as an editor, have many of those pieces that no one else has read. The pieces, or the versions, because with Etienne Arnaud there were always versions. He rewrote endings until his last breath, and apparently literally." Poirot sat opposite him, crossing his legs neatly. "So you had access to the manuscript before his death?" "Yes. Etienne gave me a first draft 2 weeks ago. He promised a shocking ending, but he didn't show it to me. He said he'd hand it in only when he was convinced it was truer than the truth." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And what did you think of the content of the draft?" Morel Bouffo, a story too close to reality. An aging writer, surrounded by flatterers, an ungrateful son, an ambiguous wife, and a secretary who idolized him. Too self-referential. Did you confront him about it? I suggested it, yes. But Etienne replied, "Every great writer ends up murdering himself on paper." Poirot leaned forward. "Was there anyone, Monsieur Morel, who had anything to lose if that story came to light?" "Besides everyone else," he replied bitterly, "that novel was a mirror. And when you put a mirror in the middle of a family, something always breaks." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think Monsieur Arnaud was planning to change his will?" "I don't know. But he told me something peculiar during our last conversation. If I don't send you the ending, consider it my final act of censorship." I never understood whether he spoke as an author or as a condemned man. Poirot stood up slowly. "Can I see the draft you have?" Morel nodded and handed him the bundle of pages. Poirot skimmed through it with practised speed. He noticed something. Some pages had folded corners, underlined details, even an ink stain, not the usual colour of Arnaud's pen, but a paler one. "Who else has touched this document, monsieur? Just me. I had it with me all the time. Although—" Morel frowned. "One night, Madame Veronique asked to see it. She said she wanted to understand what Etienne was planning to write about her. I didn't let her, of course. And Elise? I would never have asked her. She respected boundaries. Others, not so much." Poirot carefully closed the manuscript and placed it on the table. "Very well. I appreciate your cooperation. Before I left, do you think Monsieur Arnaud was aware of the danger he was in?" "Yes. But instead of running away, he decided to leave it in writing." Poirot said goodbye with a slight bow and went out into the corridor where Elise was waiting for him. "Well?" she asked anxiously. "As expected. The manuscript speaks, but it doesn't scream. There's still silence between the lines. And the letter, the one about the hiding place?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Soon. It's not yet time to show your cards. But listen carefully, mademoiselle. The poison in the cup wasn't the only crime committed. The real death occurred when someone decided to silence a story. and I intend to resurrect it, line by line." As they returned to the hall, raised voices were heard. Lucien was arguing with Veronique. "You just wanted to be Arnaud's famous widow, and you just want his name on your cheap credits." Poirot paused for a moment, then walked on, muttering to himself. "A family that bites itself before inheriting. Always a sign that the will won't be enough to calm the instincts." Chapter 6. The Truth That Is Not Inherited. The argument between Veronique and Lucien died down when they noticed Poirot's presence. The widow immediately recovered her serene air, smoothing her skirt with slow movements, while Lucien clumsily lit a cigarette, avoiding the detective's gaze. "Family matters, Monsieur Poirot," Veronique said with a wan smile. "Nothing of relevance to your investigation." Poirot didn't reply. His silence was more eloquent than a reply. He simply bowed his head and withdrew towards the main staircase, where Madame Colette was waiting for him with her hands clasped before her. "Could I go up to Mr. Arnaud's room, madame?" he asked. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, although there isn't much to see there." The gentleman slept in an austere room. He preferred the study for almost everything. The bedroom was indeed sober. A large dark wooden wardrobe, a perfectly made bed, an antique reading lamp, and an oil portrait of a young Etienne Arnaud hanging above the headboard. Poirot went straight to the wardrobe. He opened drawers, touched fabrics, and lifted lids. Nothing unusual, until he noticed something behind the portrait. A small piece of paper held together with a rusty pin. He carefully peeled it off. Dun was a yellowed sheet with a name on it. Catherine Delmas. "Madame Colette," he called. "Do you know that name?" She paled. Miss Delmas was someone important to Mr. Etienne, long before he met Veronique. She lived here for a while. It was rumoured she was going to marry him, but she suddenly disappeared. Did he disappear? She left without warning. One morning, her things were gone. The man never mentioned her again. Poirot put the paper in his leather notebook. "Can you describe it to me?" "Blonde, with a melancholic look, very reserved. She was an artist. She painted all day in the greenhouse. She never spoke of the past. And do you think the woman with the medallion could be her?" Colette hesitated for a second. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, it could be." Poirot closed the wardrobe and headed for the hallway. The greenhouse. Another forgotten scene from Arnaud's past. Why keep that photograph? Why hide his name? And why mention a snake with the face of an angel in his literary will? He headed to the side garden where the greenhouse was located. It was an aging glass building covered in vines. Inside, the air smelled of damp and earth. Old pots, dried, paintbrushes, canvases forgotten by time. An easel covered with a sheet caught his eye. He carefully removed it. It was a portrait, incomplete, but unmistakable. The face of the woman in the medallion, the same look, the same sad expression, painted with a tenderness that Poirot had only seen in farewell letters or confessions. "Catherine Delmas," he murmured. The page never written. Poirot left the greenhouse and returned to the house with the portrait. He found Elise sitting on the veranda reading a letter. "Do you recognize this woman?" he asked, showing the painting. Elise looked at him and blinked, confused. "Yes, but only from a sketch I saw years ago among old papers. Etienne said it was part of a novel he was never able to finish. He called it his impossible story. And why impossible? Because he said he couldn't write the truth without destroying someone. Poirot remained silent, looking at the portrait as if trying to extract words from the painting itself. Madame Colette told me she disappeared, but I suspect her disappearance wasn't intentional, and that someone else, even today, wants her name to remain forgotten. Elise frowned. Do you think his death has anything to do with her? Poirot put the portrait under his arm. Mademoiselle, when a man guards a lost love like a relic, and Unte then dies in the middle of a novel that revives it, it's because someone pushed him to remember or to keep quiet, and both can be dangerous. Elise looked at him with growing unease. What will you do now? Find Catherine. Not in person, perhaps, but in the memories that still breathe in this house, because I have the feeling that this crime began long before the last cup of coffee. Chapter 7. The Painter's Silence. Evening was beginning to descend on Montreuil-sur-Loire, and the long shadows of the apple trees fell on the gravel with a disturbing serenity. Poirot, walking with the portrait under his arm, seemed absorbed in a deeper contemplation than usual. He didn't go immediately to the house, but to the path along the river, where Madame Colette used to go out to smoke secretly, away from the sight of the gentleman. And there it was. Madame, Poirot said politely, one more question, if I may. She didn't turn around when she heard his voice. She stared at the water, as if the current might wash away the memories still clinging to her throat. I'm listening, Monsieur Poirot. You told me Catherine Delmas left one morning, that you never heard from her again. Colette nodded, still not looking at him. That's what I said. Poirot stood beside him. But that's not true, is it? You knew what happened to him. A tremble in the eye. Cigarette betrayed his composure. He made me promise not to tell, not even to her. To Veronique? No. Catherine, she never knew the whole truth. She was sent away. For protection. Poirot looked at her gravely. Protection from what? From herself, perhaps, and from him. Etienne could love with fierce intensity, but also with selfishness. Catherine became pregnant. It was at that moment that he wrote her out of his life. He said a pregnant wife would ruin his public image, that it wasn't yet time for scandal. So he sent her to Marseille with enough money and a false name. And the son? He never admitted it. According to his version, it didn't exist. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. Everything took on a new dimension. A hidden child, an abandoned love, a hidden painting, and now an unfinished manuscript that was perhaps more a confession than a fiction. Do you think she could have come back? I'll never know. But in recent years, Etienne talked to himself in the greenhouse, as if he were still asking for forgiveness. And did anyone else know this? I don't think so. Not Veronique, not Lucien, not even Elise. Just me. And now you. Poirot bowed slightly. I appreciate your honesty. Memory is a form of justice, Madame Colette, and you have just restored some dignity to a story that was silenced for too long. He returned to the house and went upstairs to the study with the portrait. He placed it on the desk, opposite the unfinished manuscript. Catherine's face seemed to gaze at the blank page with silent tenderness. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. It was Lucienne. "Can?" Poirot nodded. "What brings you here, Monsieur Arnaud?" "I wanted to show you something. I found a letter among the books I brought from Paris. It was inside one of my father's novels, The Wound of Iphigenia. I thought it was part of the plot, but he handed him the letter. Poirot read it. It was short and written by Etienne. If one day this letter falls into your hands, Lucien, you'll know that I never intended to erase you from the story. But there are things that an author hides for fear of falling apart. Not all children carry the surname. Some don't even carry the memory. But blood never lies." Poirot looked up in surprise. "Did you know about this?" "No, but I think the portrait explains everything. Elise told me she found it. Is that woman my mother?" "No," Poirot said calmly. "That woman is the mother of your half-brother, or sister, because you were legally recognized. But it seems you weren't your father's only child." Lucien sank into the armchair in front of the desk, his gaze lost in thought. Good heavens! So, there's another heir, or an heiress, and if that person did return, Poirot added slowly, she might have a very different reason for approaching this house. Lucien frowned. "Do you think that the killer could be that son? A vengeful offspring?" Poirot sat up. "I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think your father's final manuscript wasn't for the public, but for someone in particular. A secret reader, someone who needed an explanation more than a novel." And then he stopped, his eyes shining like when a piece finally falls into place. "Where is Elise?" "In his room, I think." "No, sir, it's not there. I looked for it just now. It's not in the library either." Lucien paled. "What do you mean?" Poirot turned slowly towards the door. "That perhaps history is being written again, but this time with a pen more dangerous than Arnaud's." Chapter 8. The Name That Never Appeared. Poirot descended the central corridor with firm steps, the echoes of his shoes tapping with mathematical precision. Every second counted. Elise Fournier, the diligent, meticulous, work-devoted woman and silent guardian of Arnaud's secrets, was not where she should be. And in Poirot's world, the details that disappear without reason are often the most significant. He entered the library. Empty, the garden, silence, the greenhouse, just the portrait. Poirot stopped in front of the easel, his lips pursed, his gaze fixed on the unfinished figure of Catherine Delmas. For the first time since his arrival, a different suspicion hovered at the edges of his thoughts. What if the most invisible person was precisely the one who had had the most access, the most motivation, and the most time? A creaking noise upstairs brought him out of his thoughts. He hurried upstairs, where he found Madame Colette in the hallway, visibly agitated. "Monsieur Poirot, Mademoiselle Elise's room is in disarray." They entered together. Sure enough, the drawers were open, several papers were on the bed, and the small leather briefcase he always carried with him was gone. "When was the last time you saw her?" asked Poirot gravely. "This morning, after breakfast. He said he needed to rest. He didn't come back." Poirot approached the desk in the room. There, under a pile of unopened correspondence, he found an envelope addressed to him. He took it delicately. Inside, a handwritten sheet of paper. Monsieur Poirot, I know you're suspicious. You're right, but not in the way you think. I didn't leave out of guilt. I left out of necessity. Some crimes don't begin with poison. They begin with abandonment. I'm following something Etienne kept from me all my life. When I find it, I'll decide what to do with the truth. He didn't just write novels. He also wrote destinies. I was one of them. The signature was barely a stroke, as if it had been written in haste, but no more was needed. Poirot folded it slowly and put it in his pocket. She knows, he murmured, and that makes her a target, or a witness to something bigger. Colette looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Poirot looked down thoughtfully. Elise wasn't just a loyal secretary. She was. But she was also something more. I think we've finally found the heiress no one named. The page no one wrote, because it would have revealed the greatest betrayal. Catherine's daughter? Exactly. The daughter Arnaud hid from the world, and who grew up in his shadow without knowing it, or half knowing it, as if her life were written between the lines. At that moment, Lucienne appeared in the doorway. They just found a ticket at the train station, he reported. A young woman asked for a ticket to Marseille less than an hour ago. Poirot frowned. Marseille, the place where Catherine was sent. Lucien paled. Do you think Elise is going to look for her? No, I think Elise is going to search for her reflection. A grave, a document, a truth, and perhaps revenge. Poirot crossed his arms. Marseille, a city where secrets age poorly. If she goes there, it's not on impulse. She's doing so because she's discovered something that compels her, something that can unravel this whole tangle of shadows. Should we go after her? Poirot calmly shook his head. Not yet. If she's gone looking for answers, she'll bring them back. Or perhaps she won't. But before we follow her, we must understand what she discovered here, within these walls. Something that compelled her to act. Something more than the manuscript. Poirot turned to Madame Colette. Where did Etienne keep his private notes? The shit ones he didn't want anyone to read. The woman hesitated, then walked into the hallway and opened a small closet built into the wall. Inside, a double shelf lined with red velvet. Here. But I only had a notebook. A small one. I saw it 2 days ago. The shelf was empty. He's gone, said Poirot in a low voice. Lucien ran a hand over his face. So, Elise took her? Exactly. And now we know for sure he found something. Something Etienne had been jealously hiding. A confession, perhaps. A belated recognition. And upon reading it, he didn't run away, but made a decision. Poirot approached the window. The afternoon was slowly dying, and the sky was turning a dull red. This all started with a blank page. And now I understand why. Arnaud couldn't finish his story because that last line didn't belong to him. It belonged to her. Chapter 9. The Diary He Never Published. Night had completely fallen on the Arnaud estate, and the atmosphere within its walls was dense, as if every unspoken word had acquired physical weight. Poirot remained in the study, sitting in front of the unfinished manuscript, his fingers interlaced, his eyes fixed on the portrait of Catherine Delma. Behind him, Madame Colette gently closed the curtains. "Do you think Mademoiselle Elise will return?" she asked in a low voice. Poirot didn't reply immediately. Finally he spoke, without taking his eyes off the canvas. "If he found out what I suspect, he'll come back, but not as the same person. Because discovering you've been part of a structural lie doesn't just transform the present, it rewrites the past." Colette, her hands firmly clasped, took a deep breath. I watched her grow up in this house, always silent, always watching. I never thought she could be the ghost's daughter, Poirot added softly, because that's what Catherine was to this house, a presence that refused to disappear entirely. Lucien burst into the study, agitated. "Poirot, an envelope has arrived by express courier. It's from Marseille. It's addressed to you." Poirot raised an eyebrow and stood carefully. He took the envelope and examined it. Greyish paper, no return address, but with firm, feminine handwriting. He broke the seal and extracted a single sheet of paper and a black leather notebook. The note said, "I don't know yet if I should forgive him, but I deserve to know everything. This notebook contains the truth that was never published. I'm sending you a copy. I'll keep the original for now, not out of greed, out of justice." Elise Poirot opened the notebook with great care. The first pages were filled with dated notes, some smudged. It wasn't a novel, but a diary. The diary of Etienne Arnaud. He read quietly to himself. "September. The baby girl is born. Catherine has decided to name her Elise. I don't dare correct her, or look her in the eye. I hate myself for it. She deserves more than my cowardice. But I can't break the persona I've built. A public man can't be a secret father." Poirot turned the page. "February. Catherine has left. She says she'd rather raise the child away from my world. She's right. I don't know if I'll have the courage to see her again. I've left instructions with Colette to keep an eye on everything. I've wired her funds under another name. Sometimes I wake up feeling like the child is watching me from the shadows of my own books." Poirot closed the notebook and sighed. Then he handed it to Lucien, who read the first few lines and paled. "So, it's all true. Elise is her daughter, and my sister. Half-sister," Poirot corrected gently. "But no less legitimate, emotionally, than you. What if she was the one who poisoned him?" "No," Poirot said immediately. "It wasn't her. Everything she's done is to understand, not to take revenge. The poison, it came from someone else, someone who had something to lose if this truth came out." Lucien remained thoughtful. "Speedwell. Who else?" Poirot replied. "Imagine for a moment that you discovered that not only did your husband have an illegitimate daughter, but that he had written a new will, one that left you out entirely. What would a proud, ambitious woman, accustomed to being in control, do?" Lucien murmured. "I would find the manuscript, the will, and if I couldn't destroy them, I would destroy the man." Poirot nodded, but he made a mistake. He underestimated Elise, and above all, he underestimated the power of an unfinished story. At that moment Madame Colette appeared in the doorway. "Monsieur Poirot, There's someone at the entrance. It's Elise." Poirot stood up without a word and walked with measured steps down the hall. Elise was waiting for him, soaked by the rain, with the leather suitcase in her hand and her eyes full of suppressed fire. "I came back," he said, "but not with hatred, just with questions. I need to know if my mother died knowing he loved her, or if he betrayed her to the very end." Poirot looked at her with respect. "Mademoiselle, I think the answer lies in what you didn't write, and also in what you chose not to do." She nodded. Then she turned to Lucien, who was slowly descending the stairs. "And you?" Lucien looked at her for a few seconds. "I guess I finally have a sister. You don't choose your family, but you do choose what you do with the truth." Poirot turned around, looking at the hall clock. The hands were pointing to 10. "It's time," he said. "I'll call everyone together tomorrow. There's a revelation pending, and this time there won't be any blank pages." Chapter 10. The Rehearsed Ending. The morning dawned grey over the Arnaud estate. A thick fog covered the gardens like a complicit blanket, unwilling to reveal what had happened within its walls. In the main hall, Poirot had arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle, facing the large marble fireplace. Each seat had a specific location, as if it were part of a chessboard carefully prepared for a final checkmate. At 9:30 sharp, all the characters were summoned. Veronique, immaculate and icy, appeared with a black shawl draped over her shoulders, and the expression of a widow, aware that she was on trial, even though there was no courtroom. Lucien, standing next to Elise, exchanged glances with his new sister. There was no trust between them yet, but a nascent alliance. Madame Colette sat in a corner with her hands clasped, like an ancient figure who has seen too many tragedies played out in the same room. Gérard Morel, visibly restless, nervously leafed through the unfinished manuscript that Poirot had deliberately left on the coffee table. Poirot appeared punctually, like a director who knows the curtain is about to rise for the last time. "Mesdames, Messieurs, I thank you for your presence. I have gathered everyone here because, as you well know, Monsieur Etienne Arnaud did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned, but not by an outside enemy, nor by a stranger. He was murdered by someone in this inner circle. An invisible tension ran through the room. At first, I thought the motive was the unfinished manuscript," he continued, "a document with literary and financial implications. Then I thought the hidden will might have sparked greed, but last night I realized the truth. The real motive wasn't inheritance, nor literature, but identity." Poirot walked slowly to the table, took the portrait of Catherine Delmas, and showed it to those present. This woman was part of Arnaud's past, not just any secret lover, but the mother of his first child, Elise. An unrecognized daughter, hidden from the world, but present in his life more than many knew how to admit. And that truth, mes amis, was a risk. Veronique's eyes shone with an imperceptible gleam. "And what does that have to do with his death, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot turned to her. "Everything. You, madame, discovered that truth recently, perhaps by chance, perhaps because Elise found something she shouldn't have and started asking questions. You learned that Etienne was planning to change his will. You learned that Elise would become not only the heir, but also the symbol, the redeemed daughter, and that left you out of control. That's an accusation, she whispered. No, madam, it's a deduction. You brought the cup and the poison. There is no evidence. Yes, there are. You yourself said you used the usual coffee jar, but that jar didn't contain coffee. I discovered it this morning. The contents were a carefully adulterated mixture with traces of cyanide, enough to kill someone in a few minutes, without leaving a visible trace. And more importantly, only you touched it. Because the cook wasn't there. Because no one else had any reason to prepare that drink. And you knew Elise wouldn't come. But Veronique's face hardened. Then she smiled with a disturbing calm. What if it was Elise? What if this is all a sham to protect her? Elise took a step forward. Her eyes were firm, but not vengeful. I went to Marseille to search for the past, not to cover up a crime. If I had wanted to punish Etienne, I would have used words, not poison. Poirot nodded. And that's what you didn't understand, madame. The new generation doesn't destroy. It writes, it transforms. The most lethal act here wasn't the poison. It was the desire to silence a story. And that story, you ended it. Veronique remained silent for a few seconds. Then, slowly, she turned toward the fireplace. I don't regret it, she murmured. He made us all characters. I just chose the moment to close the book. A deathly silence fell over the room. Gérard Morel, still pale, cleared his throat. What will happen now? Poirot turned to Madame Colette, who had already discreetly dialed the police number on the hall telephone. Now, Monsieur Morel, each of us will return to our place, in life, in truth, and in the manuscript that finally can be finished. Lucien looked at Elise. What will you do with the legacy? She answered without hesitation. I'll tell it, but fairly. Not as a hidden daughter, but as the author of the final chapter. Poirot bowed slightly. Alors, the end, and this time without blank pages. Chapter 11. Handwritten justice an hour after the revelation, the Arnaud estate was plunged into an unusual silence. It wasn't the same silence that had reigned after Etienne's death, filled with bewilderment and speculation. This was a different silence, cleaner, almost liberating. A veil had fallen, the masks had been removed, and the words, those that Etienne Arnaud so revered, had finally found their place. Veronique was escorted away by the police without any drama. She shed no tears, nor did she utter a single word in her own defence. She merely nodded when Poirot mentioned that her confession would come, not out of remorse, but out of vanity. She'll want to have the last word in her own story, he said. As a good widow of a storyteller, she won't be able to resist telling her version. Gérard Morel, finding himself removed from the scandal, discreetly requested the incomplete manuscript. To protect Etienne's legacy, he said, but Elise calmly refused. The manuscript no longer belongs to you, she said, not to you nor to any editor. It's part of another story now. Lucienne observed her with a mixture of respect and resignation. That young woman, who until recently had been a mere figure in the background of the house, now stood as the heir to a truth he was only just beginning to understand. And what will you do with all this? He asked her, as they strolled through the garden under the first rays of sunlight. I don't know exactly, Elise replied. I don't want revenge, nor glory. I just want the words that were hidden for decades to see the light. I don't want Catherine's story to be erased. I don't want my name to be on the margins." Lucien nodded. "Perhaps you can write your own version, not as Arnaud's daughter, but as an author. Maybe, but I won't use your style. I'll write as I am, clear, direct, without embellishments to disguise the guilt." Inside the house, Poirot was sipping his last coffee on the veranda, accompanied by Madame Colette. They both gazed at the landscape with the stillness of those who have solved not only a crime, but a tangle of ancient emotions. "Do you think you'll find peace now, Monsieur Poirot?" the woman asked. He nodded gently. "For the living, yes. For the dead, silence is all that remains. But when that silence is replaced by truth, then even memory can breathe freely." "And Catherine?" Colette whispered. "She lives on in the daughter who wrote what her mother could never say." He placed the cup on the saucer and stood up. "This house needs air. New words, new voices, no more characters trapped in an unfinished manuscript. Adieu." Poirot said goodbye to everyone with his usual courtesy. Elise caught up with him at the door. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you, not only for uncovering the truth, but for treating it with respect." "Mademoiselle," he replied with a slight bow, "the truth is not a verdict. It is an unfinished work, and you have taken up the pen." She handed him a small envelope. "I found this among the old papers. It was a letter my mother wrote but never sent. I think it's only right that you have it." Poirot accepted it carefully. He didn't open it. He put the envelope in his inside jacket pocket, like a silent jewel. "Perhaps one day I'll read it, but for now I prefer to imagine what it says. Imagination, mademoiselle, is also a form of justice." And with that, he walked off down the gravel path, his cane tapping rhythmically, like a metronome marking the end of a complex symphony. Chapter 12. Epilogue. Grey cells never sleep. A week after the events at the Arnaud estate, Hercule Poirot found himself in his apartment on the Rue des Martyrs in Paris. The rain tapped gently against the windows as the detective finished sorting through a series of documents he had brought with him from Montreuil-sur-Loire. On the tea-table, next to his perfectly balanced chamomile tea, lay the envelope Elise had given him before her departure. He hadn't yet opened it. Across the room, the fire crackled quietly. The scene was peaceful, but in Poirot's mind, the small grey cells continued to dance. The resolution of the Arnaud case didn't satisfy him in the most usual sense. There was justice, yes, and a revealed truth. But more subtle shadows remained. Not crimes, but inherited silences. With a thoughtful gesture, Poirot finally opened the envelope. Catherine Delmas's letter was short, written in sweet, almost fragile handwriting. "Elise, if you ever read this, I want you to know that you were never a mistake. What your father and I shared was real, even if the world denied it. I kept you from his world to protect you from the pain that destroyed me. But I never stopped loving him, even if it meant forgetting myself. If you ever doubt your worth, remember this. You are the line no one had the courage to write. Be the one to do it, and write with truth, not resentment." Poirot closed his eyes, not out of sadness, but because of the precise weight of each word. In that instant, he understood that his intervention had not only unmasked a murderer, but had rescued a story that had been buried beneath social convenience, and the ego of an author who, until the very end, wanted to control his narrative even more than his life. Above the fireplace in his apartment hung a small black-and-white photograph. In it, Poirot and Arnaud were pictured at a literary fair years ago. Arnaud smiled as if nothing could touch him. A man who lived by words but feared silence, Poirot thought. Later that day, he received a letter from Lucien. Mr. Poirot, Elise has started writing. Not about the crime, not about Arnaud. She writes about Catherine. She says her mother's story deserves to be told in light, not shadows. Perhaps it's the best way to close the circle. Thank you for giving us the courage to face the truth. L. Poirot placed the letter on the table. Then he took out his personal notebook and wrote a final note. Case closed. The death of Etienne. Arnaud was the final act in a drama that began with a blank page and ended with an invisible signature, that of a silenced woman. The culprit, Véronique Arnaud, acted out of pride, fear, and a desperate desire not to be forgotten. But true justice lies not in punishment, but in allowing the truth to breathe. Élise Fournier is proof that even the most broken stories can find redemption. Signed H. Poirot. He turned off the lamp, closed his notebook, and let the crackling of the fire envelop him. The small grey cells could finally rest.